Hi class, welcome to our virtual class, although this is not synchronous, as we discuss today adjusting entries, particularly the one on deferrals. We're supposed to meet you to discuss the answers to the practice set, and that will be our springboard for our discussion on deferrals. However, as you all know, the school advisory is that we won't hold any video conference with our students until after the telcos are done with their maintenance, which is September 30 or Wednesday, okay, of this week. So that means the earliest that we can possibly hold a virtual class is Friday. And then again, when I checked your calendar, murag na anapud mo'y seminar on October 5, that is a Monday. So we are expecting a number of disruptions in our class. But I hope that these pre-recorded video lectures will also serve the same purpose as if we are really meeting virtually. Okay, so I hope that you have met with your study buddies. It's always, always, always good to have somebody to discuss with when you talk about accounting, particularly this time when you talk about adjusting entries. Now, I know a lot of you are a little bit anxious, no? Kaya nagsugod na gud og adjusting entries. I don't know how your experience was in senior high when you discussed adjusting entries. I hope it wasn't very traumatic. But just for me to know that you are watching this video, please comment in our Facebook page where this video is linked. So ato mo comment sa Facebook ha, dili sa YouTube. So comment on the Facebook, on our Facebook page as your login for this particular lecture. How was your experience in adjusting entries during your senior high? Okay, so just to give me an idea kung kumusta inyong discussion, ani nga topic during your senior high, right? So, sige, let's get started. Like what I have said, today we're going to focus on deferrals. So before we do that, let us first answer the question, what are adjusting entries? No? So adjusting entries are actually journal entries that bring the accounts up to date at the end of the accounting period. So meaning to say, ang purpose dahil sa adjusting entries is to update the accounts. And adjusting entries are also called end of period entries. Why? Because they are made and they will only appear at the end of the accounting period. So I think the more important question to ask now is when is the when is the end of the accounting period? Okay? Is it December 31? Is it always December 31? The answer is no. No, although very common yun na nga ang end of the accounting period December 31, kung ang gigamit sa business is the calendar year. So if you remembered, ang calendar year mag-start na siya og January, kanya mo end na siya og mo start na siya January 1 rather, niya mo end na siya og December 31 kay mo follow mo na siya sa calendar. However, we also know that there is what we call a fiscal year, and a fiscal year might begin on any day except the first day of January and would end 12 months thereafter. And so therefore, kung mingon nga adjusting entries, himuon na siya at the end of the accounting period, and the accounting period will depend, no, kung calendar year ba gigamit sa business or fiscal year ba. So you have to be very careful about that. No, especially later when we count the number of months, for example, kung pila ang na-expense or pila ang na-revenue, kaya ito biya mo stop counting at the end of the accounting period. So kinahanglan, sakto ang pag-determine kung kano sa ang end sa accounting period. Okay? Now, perhaps you have also asked the question, why do we need adjusting entries? No? Siguro sa mga nakaagian ni sa senior high, medyo traumatic ang experience and you would notice na labad kini siya sa o. And so perhaps you have asked the question, nga nung maglisod-lisod na dito sa atong kinabuhi, maghimuhimu pa man kita adjusting entries. Na? So why do we need them? Why do we need adjusting entries? Well, do you remember the accrual basis of accounting? Katubitaw niingon siya that revenue is to be recognized when earned regardless of when cash is received, and expenses are recognized when incurred, regardless of whether you have paid for it or not. Si accrual basis of accounting basically tells us no nga revenue and expenses do not depend on when you have received or paid the cash. So it is precisely this timing difference in the recording of the revenue and its related cash or the expense and its related outflow of cash that has caused some accounts to be a little bit confused. No? So at the end of the accounting period, na yung ibang mga accounts nga naa na sila identity crisis, no? Because a part of them is already consumed, but a part of them still remains to be an asset. Or a part of them is still unearned, but also a portion has already been rendered and so therefore earned already. Okay, so let's have this very simple example. Of course, we're drawing a timeline, as you would have guessed. And let's just say that the beginning of the year is January 1, 2019, because the business is following or using a calendar year. And because calendar year man siya, 12 months thereafter, mo close ang business. And the end of the accounting period is December 31, 2019. Let me clarify that. Dili mo close ang business nga manirad yun ang business. Ha? Just that the year of the business would close on December 31, 2019. So we have the beginning of the year, January 1, and the end of the year, December 31. Now, what if something happened on February 1? Because what if on February 1, the business decided to purchase supplies? And the supplies is worth 1,000. Now, let's just assume that the business purchased the supplies for cash. And so therefore, the entry of the business will be a debit to supplies on hand for 1,000 and a credit to cash for 1,000. Okay, so if we are going to recognize the accounts that we used, supplies at hand is an asset account. So even if we used only the account title supplies, that is still an asset account. Okay, cash is of course an asset account. So this particular transaction increased the asset supplies at hand and decreased another asset in the form of cash. If we are going to open the T accounts for supplies on hand, and because later on we know the supplies will be consumed, let's also open the T account for supplies expense, then you would notice based on this entry that we have a debit entry to supplies on hand, but nothing under supplies expense. Why? Because as of February 1, the business recognizes that the 1,000 peso worth of supplies has not yet been consumed. And so therefore, you decided to recognize it as supplies on hand. Again, please take note, supplies on hand is an asset. And so therefore, as of February 1, 2019, your asset account supplies on hand has a balance of 1,000. Okay, at that point, it's just our regular journal entry. Okay, now what if at the end of the year, there was an inventory count that was conducted, and one of the things that they counted was the supplies on hand. And then they noticed that of the 1,000 peso supplies on hand, actually 750 pesos of it has already been consumed. No? So, nagpalit ta og supplies on hand before nga 1,000, karon 750 pesos na consumed na. No? And so therefore, kung 1,000 atong gipalit before niya, 750 ang na-consumed, pila di ay nahibilin sa ato ang supplies on hand based on the count. Okay? So, ang nahibilin na lang is only 250 pesos. And so therefore, the correct DI nga balance sa asset na supplies on hand is only 250. Okay? Because na naman tayo supplies expense nga 750. But take a look at our T accounts. Okay, remember, wa pa nag-adjusting entries. So, tanawa ang ato ang T accounts. Di ba atong T accounts, nag-recognize siya og supplies on hand nga 1,000, unya zero supplies expense. So, therefore, if the accountant will not make an adjusting entry, okay, so therefore, if no adjustment is made, unsa may mahitabo? So, atong tanawan class ha, ang atong supplies on hand sa T account 1,000. Pero kahibaw ta nga di na 1,000 ang nahibilin. No, ang nahibilin na lang yun nga supplies is only 250. And so therefore, tell me, is the balance of 1,000 correct? The answer is no. Wrong na siya. Kay kahibaw man ta nga na na-consume na. No? So 1,000 pa ang nasa tong libro, pero ang nara sa actual count is 250. So now tell me, is our supplies on hand, as recorded in our books, overstated or understated? When we say overstated, nanubra ba ni ang 1,000? When we say understated, kuwang ba ni ang 1,000? Okay, so let's take a moment. Let's take a moment to reflect on that. No, so based on our count, 250 ra ang asset tin anay. Mao ginay nakit-an nato paghihap nato. Pero pag tanaw nato sa tong T account, uy, 1,000 pa man ang amount. So therefore, is the T account sobra or kuwang? The T account is sobra, right? Kay 1,000 gud na, 250 ra gud ang actual. So therefore, the assets are overstated. So if you do not make an adjusting entry, the assets in this instance will be overstated by 750. Now take a look at the T account for supplies expense. Pilay balance nga na diha. Di ba zero? No, wala man ay amount ang supplies expense. Kaya siya ga-recognize the expense. Pero we know that 750 pesos of the supplies have already been consumed. And so therefore, kay consumed man, so dapat expense na unta siya. Right? And so therefore, if no adjustment is made, then ang ato ang supplies nga gi-recognize sa books, zero, but ang correct unta is 750. So ang balikon ha, ang books, zero, pero ang correct unta is 750. Therefore, is supplies expense as recorded in the books overstated or understated? Sobra or kuwang? So remember, ang point of reference ang naka sa T account. Okay, so si T account, sobra or kuwang? So quite obviously, si T account, kuwang. Kay zero good na, dapat 750 man. So therefore, expenses are understated by 750. Now, we must also remember that expenses will affect profit. Diba? So imagine ako no class kung pananglitan, wala ka nag-recognize of 750 na expense. So supposedly, ang business na aunta siya expense nga 750, pero nakalimot man kagimo sa adjusting entry. No, kay putlang basin ka party-party ka pag December 31, nakalimot kagimo sa adjusting entry, no, for the consumed supplies. And so therefore, ang ato ang expenses wa na record. Kung wala na record ang expenses, kung sino mahitabo sa profit? No, will profit be overstated or understated? Remember, wa ka ka-record ng expenses. So therefore, if expenses are understated, profit is actually overstated. Nanubra ang imuhang gi-recognize nga ginansya nga naman kay wa man nimo gi-recognize ang expense. No? So it is precisely because of this that we need adjusting entries. No, kay kung walay adjusting entries, sayop na ang amount nga atong i-recognize as asset, overstated siya, atong expenses ma-understated, ug ang atong profit nga i-report is also understated. In other words, misstated ang ato ang imuon unya nga financial statements. So therefore, because we know that adjusting entries are important and necessary, so on December 31, we will prepare the adjusting entry. Now, take note that everything here is recorded as supplies in hand. Wa siya nag-recognize of expense. So to correct that, we will need to recognize the expense. So debit supplies expense, 750. And then we will need to decrease the supplies on hand. Kaya nunubra man ang supplies on hand. 1,000 pa man na. 250 na malay na ibilin. So we need to decrease it by 750 by crediting supplies on hand. And then you will notice once we post the entry, so atong i-post ha, credit supplies on hand, and then debit supplies expense, inikuha nimo sa balances class, kay mo appear na ang correct amounts. No? So, ang imuhang supplies on hand, 250 na, as what we have seen in the count. Unya atong supplies expense, ni-reflect na siya sa correct amount na 750, which is the amount of the supplies consumed. Right? So kung ka-imagine mo, kung wala pa taga-adjusting entry, sayop-sayop ang ato ang account balances. But because we prepare the adjusting entries at the end of the period, we have appropriately updated the accounts to their correct balances. Okay? Sige. Now that we have outlined the importance of adjusting entries, let us now take a look at some helpful tips first before we proceed. Okay, number one, all adjusting entries affect at least one income statement account and one balance sheet account. No? So, yun ang mabantayan later once you keep on preparing adjusting entries. No? One way for you to determine kung correct ba na imong gihimo na entry or dili is that all adjusting entries naagin na siya at least one income statement account, or if you would remember, income statement accounts are also nominal accounts, and at least one balance sheet account or real account. Right? Another thing is be careful. Check when the end of the accounting period is. It is not always December 31. Okay, so this would happen if the business uses a fiscal year. No? So bantayan na kung kano sa ang end sa accounting period. Next, how do you count the number of months? And I know that there are some of you, no, during the practice set, some of you kay na naglibog mo or trick mo because naay ubang transactions nga nitabo siya first day of the month, nga naay ubang transactions nga nitabo siya last day of the month. No? So, unsaon man din na siya ang correct way of counting the number of months. So, if the coverage starts on the first day, so for example, naka-insurance premium nga gibayaran, the insurance premium starts on the first day, April 1. Include the month in the counting. Okay, so meaning to say, kung mayon tag April 1 to December 31, ang pag-ihap ana is April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December. So in other words, that is 9 months. Okay, so if the coverage starts on the first day, that is April 1, for example, include the current month in the counting. So include April in the counting. But if the coverage starts on the last day, for example, April 30, exclude April and start counting, and count starting the next month. Okay, so panalitan mo tag April 30, ayaw apila sa April. No, magsugod na kag count og May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December. So April 30 to December 31 is actually 8 months. Nga naman na siya class, no? So if you come to think about it, si April 30, unfair man na kung imo siyang ipon as 1 month, kay 1 day ra man na si April 30. No, so it is unfair for you to count it as 1 whole month. So mo nang sa May na gyud ka magsugod og ihap. Pero kung maingon ka class April 1, no, ang long cut ana, long cut na ato itawag. Ang long cut ana is saying April 1 to April 30, May 1 to May, pila ka days? May 1 to May 31, June 1 to June 30, no, July 1 to July 1 to July 31, August 1 to August 31, September 1 to September 30, October 1 to October 31, November 1 to November 30, December 1 to December 31. So mo nang apilon ni mong ihap sa April kay 1 man na siya. Meaning to say, makounted pa ang whole month of April, no? Pero kung aray ka sa second class, April 30 naman in town. So, ang 30, di mo na siya considered as 1 month. No? So, murag 1 day naman na siya. So, mean to say, ato na ka magsugod starting May 1 to May 30, May 1 to May 31, June 1 to June 30, and so on. Okay, so remember, if the coverage is on the first day, include that particular month. Pero if the coverage starts on the last day, ato na ka mo ihap sa next month ana niya. Because the last day is not counted as 1 whole month. Okay, so I hope that somehow helped, no? Para later on, kung maka-encounter mo mga problems na ingon ana, kay balon na mo unsay bantayanan, no? Kay mao na usual tricks sa mga examiner. Sa mga ilahang first usual nga trick. First trick ana nila class, para tanaw nila nakasabot bagid mo, dili calendar year ilang gamiton, fiscal year. No, because they would like to see kung dili ba mo malipat, no, tan-aw kung kano sa year end. Second nila nga trick gamiton ana is instead of the first day of the month, gamiton nila ang last day of the month. Right, so therefore, if that's the case, masayap na kung bumihap. Imagine 1 month be ang difference ana, no? So you have to be careful about these things. Okay? Sige. Now, let's talk about what items require adjusting entries. I'm pretty sure if you have discussed this in your senior high, na-discuss, buta na po ninyo siya, no, with your teachers. But basically, ang two major groups with class na mo require of adjusting entries are deferrals, and then you have accruals. So, hato pa lang i-focus karon na pata sa deferrals na part. So, unsa man ang deferrals? Deferrals are created by recording a transaction in a way that delays or defers the recognition of an expense or revenue. In other words, kung deferral gani ang istoryahan na anay kwarta nga involved. Okay, so either nakadawat na ka og money or nakabayad na ka og kwarta or cash. Pero wala pa ang related revenue or expense. No? So again, basta gani deferrals ang isgutan sa original entry nimo na kay cash involved, either a receipt of cash or a payment of cash. So one very basic example of this is, for example, when an expense is paid in advance before it is consumed. No, so gibayran nimo daan before nimo siya gi-consume. Sa pananglitan kanang magpa-load mo, for example, magpa-load mo og 300 pesos, no? Kay naay daghang online video conferencing sa klase, so nagpa-load mo og 300 pesos, pero upon purchasing the load, wala pa man na nimo siya gigamit, no? So you have paid for it in advance, pero wala pa nimo siya na consume. Another example of a deferral is when a revenue is collected in advance before it is earned. Okay, so my example, Ana. So imagine class if the business, for example, is an airline company. Yeah, kanang airline company class, for those of you who have tried, no, taking a flight or, riding on an airplane, then you would notice na mubayad kadaan before ka mosakay sa eroplano, right? Dili man na mo ingon nga mularga ka ni abot nimo sa imong destination diya pa ka mobayad, no? So mubayad kadaan before ka makasakay sa airplane. In fact, you can book your flights in advance, no? So mularga ka inig year 2021 pa kay mahuman na ang COVID, no? So muto kag Japan. So nipalit kadaan og airline tickets for Japan para sa imuhang trip in the year 2021. So imagine nga ikaw ang airline company, di ba nakadawat kadaan sa bayad sa imong customer, pero wala pa nimo na render ang service kay wala pa man siya nilarga. No, so to the airline company, the advance booking made by its customers is an example of a revenue that is collected in advance before it is earned. On the other hand, class, when we talk about accruals, kanang accruals mo na siya itong lesson sa sunod after this one, no, after deferrals. An accrual class or accruals are created by an unrecorded expense that has already been incurred or an unrecorded revenue that has already been earned. No? So, if sa deferrals na anay cash daan, gibayran nimo daan ang expense, wala pa nimo siya na-consume or na-incur, or gi-collect nimo daan, no, ang money, wala pa nimo na-render ang service, wala pa na-earn ang revenue, sa accruals, baliktad siya. Because sa accruals, naano gid ang expense, pero wapa nimo siya bayre. Sa accruals na ana ang revenue pero wa pa nimo siya na kolekta. Okay, so example of accruals are when an expense is incurred but not yet paid. Panalitan class, if you talk about your utilities, di ba every day you make use of electricity but you don't pay VECO every day. Right? Tingbon mo na nato siya bayad tanan. Unya ang atong electricity for the month of September, for example, paninglo na siya ni VECO inig ka October pa. No? So meaning to say, as of September, na kay expense nga na-incur but wala pa siya na bayaran. That is an example of an accrued expense. No? On another hand, if you have, for example, a revenue that is already earned but not yet received, saya pasabot ana, no, na-earn na nimo ang revenue pero wala pa lang nimo gikolekta, pareha bitaw ni siya sa ato ang accounts receivable class. No? So, nirender na ka sa service pero wala pa kabayri sa customer. Okay. Another example is when pananglitan, you have the business has extra funds and then the business deposits this, for example, in the bank. No, na siya time deposit in the bank, for example. Kanya, as time would go by, no, mo-accrue man ang interest ana niya, but you don't actually collect the interest from the bank every day, no? So, tingbon man na nimo siya most likely at the end of the term, no, of your time deposit, for example. Pero every day that your money is in the bank, it is already earning. Pero wala pa lang nimo siya na kolekta. No, paano siya na-receive. So, that is an example of an accrued revenue. Accrued expenses are by its essence payables, whereas accrued revenue is, in its very core, receivables. Okay, but our topic for this particular lecture video is deferrals man. So let's try to focus on the deferrals. Okay, when an expense is paid in advance before it is consumed, we actually call it a prepaid expense. And there's basically two ways by which we can account for prepaid expense. We have what we call the asset method and the expense method. Okay, unsa may difference anang duha. No? So, in the case, for example, of the asset method, the entire amount was recognized as an asset during the original entry. When we say original entry, mao ni siya ang date kung kanus-an nimo gibayran, no, in advance ang imong unconsumed or not yet incurred nga expense. So pagbayad nimo ang imong gidebit dili expense, ang imong gidebit tanan was an asset. An expense method, on the other hand, is when the entire amount was recognized as an expense during the original entry. So, pananglitan class no, going back to our example on the supplies. No? So, pananglitan, palit kag supplies, yabaga ko man, ibayran nimo in cash. Kung nag-asset method ka, ang i-debit nimo will be supplies or supplies on hand, which is all of it is an asset. No? So, ang logic sa accountant ana kung may siya asset method mga na siya nga well as of the date nga ako ni siyang gipalit asset pa man ni siya no so ako siyang i-recognize as asset tanan no pero kung mag-expense method ka class ang i-debit sa accountant is supplies expense debit supplies expense and then credit cash no so ang logic pud sa accountant ani is ay magurot naman pud gihapon ni siya tanan no eventually kaning tanang supplies nga atong gipalit ma-consume ra man gyud ni siya kay unsa man igamit sa tong pagpalit ani so therefore ako na lang siyang i-expense daan and so therefore when the accountant when the accountant records the purchase mo debit din siya supplies expense unya mo credit siya og cash okay so both methods are actually acceptable so whether you choose the asset method or the expense method acceptable na siya just remember that you can only choose one ha so dili pwede nga imong i-record permiro asset ni imong po i-record balik expense so isa ra gyud na siya ka method no ang imong gamiton no when you prepare the entry kay syempre isa ra man na ka transaction so choose either asset or expense method no so what if miss dili isulti sa problem kung unsa nga method ang gigamit no so pwede man na ninyo siya matan-aw class no kung unsa nga account title ang naa no or ang available. And if in case gani gid class, silent ang problem class, wala siya niingon kung asset ba or expense method, then the assumption is go for the asset method. Now, the asset method is also called the real approach. Nung anong gitawag man siya real approach because an asset is a balance sheet account and the balance sheet account is a real account. In the same manner that the expense method is also called the nominal approach. No, nominal approach na siya class because an expense is an income statement account and income statement accounts are nominal accounts. Okay, so let's now take a look at a sample of unsay mahitabo no sa imuhang entries kung mogamit ta og asset method or expense method. So under the asset method, in the original entry, everything is recorded as an asset. Everything no, is recorded as an asset. And nothing is recorded as an expense. Take note, we're talking about the original entry. And so therefore, we would notice at the end of the year, we would need to adjust. No, because somehow along the way, no, during the accounting period, we know that some of the assets have already been consumed. And once consumed or used, transferred na siya to expense. O kay tungod iya mang gi-record tanan as an asset, so we have to recognize tong portion na nagamit na and so we would need to decrease the asset. Okay? And we know then nga naaman untay dapat expense pero pag sugod, pag original entry, wala siya ga-recognize og expense. So we need to recognize the expense or increase the expense. Okay, now let us try to review a bit kung kamao ba ta mo journalize. How do we decrease an asset? Debit or credit? To decrease an asset, we have to credit the asset. And how do we increase expense? How do we increase expense? Debit or credit? To increase expense, we have to debit the expense. In other words, class, kung asset method gani na siya, ang pro forma entry ana is debit expense, credit, asset. The general rule is that, or the rule is that, if the business uses the asset method during the adjusting entry, you will have to recognize the expense. Okay? Now, if if the business is using an expense method or the expense method, that means in the original entry, everything was recorded as an expense. No? So, wa siya gi-recognize nga asset. Ang tanan, iyang gi-recognize as expense. And then we all know somewhere along the course of, the entire accounting period, that wala na hurot ang tanan, no? Wala na consume ang tanan, na ay nahibilin. And so, kadtong nahibilin class, kailangan to nato siyang i-recognize. Therefore, we need to recognize the asset, no? So, mag-increase sa asset, and we need to decrease the expense. Nga naman, kay iya manggi record tanan as expense, yan na may portion ana nga wala pa nagamit o wala pa na-consume. No? And so therefore, kung nag-expense method ganina ang imuhang business, we will debit the asset in the adjusting entry, debit asset, credit, expense. No? So, as a rule then, kung asset method gani, you have to recognize the expense. And when we recognize the expense, meaning we have to increase the expense. And how to increase expense? Debit or credit? Debit the expense. Pero kung expense method, ganin na iyahang gigamit class, we have to recognize the asset. No? And how do you recognize the asset? By increasing the asset. And you increase an asset by debiting the asset. Okay, so these are just general rules, no, that might help you remember when you prepare the adjusting entries. Now let's elevate our understanding to a much more analytical level. Kay later on ra ba class, for example, himo una ni siya board exam question, no, or departmental exam question, or maybe our midterm exam question, you would know nga i-convert dayon ni siya sa examiners into a multiple choice type, no? So yeah, para analytical gid siya class, normally ang ipangutana sa examiner ninyo class is unsay mahitabo kung walay adjusting entry nga buhaton. So kung pananglitan ang accountant no or ang bookkeeper wa siya nakahimo sa adjusting entry, nakalimot siya or wa niya nabantayan no. So unsa man di ay ang effect ana niya. Okay? So if no adjusting entry is made and the client use the asset method. Remember, under the asset method, everything is recognized as an asset. There is no regard for expense. No? Masin pag naay na consume, wa niya na adjust. So kay wa man niya na adjust class, assets will be, you have failed to recognize the expense. Kay wa man ka nag-adjust. No? So meaning to say your asset is, sorry, the expense method failed to recognize asset. At sa unahan ng asset method class. No? So when you fail to recognize the expense, kay wala ka nag-adjusting entry, yung asset method ang gigamit, then assets are overstated. Nanubra ang asset. Kaya wa man ni mag-recognize an expense. Nya kayang expense, wa man na-recognize, that means expense is understated. So nagkuwang ang imuhang gi-record nga expense. Ug kay nagkuwang man ang imuhang gi-record na expense, that means nanubra ang imuhang ginansya. Profit is overstated. And when profit is overstated, because profit will eventually be reflected under equity, then equity is also overstated. So kung si accountant makalimot siya himo og adjusting entry under the asset method, in other words, si accountant wala siya naka-recognize of expense, manubra ang asset, magkuwang ang expenses, ug tungod kay nagkuwang man ang expenses, nanubra imong ginansya, ug kay nanubra man imong ginansya, nanubra pud ang equity. No? So, maka-imagine ka class imong financial statements ana no in town. No? So, misstated imong financial statements. You would also notice that expenses and profit have an opposite effect. No? So, nasa sila inverse relationship. As one is understated, the other is overstated. Mo na relationship ni expense ug ni profit. And you would also notice na si profit ug si equity, pareho siyang effect. An overstatement in one overstates the other as well. So naa sila'y direct effect. So expenses and profit, inverse effect, profit and equity, that is direct effect. Needless to say, kung expenses niya mula kag equity, expenses to equity, understated ang expenses, overstated ang equity, that means iyahapong relationship is inverse po. Okay? Opposite ang iyahang effect. Okay? Now let's take a look at what happens if nag-expense method ang business, unya si accountant nakalimot na pud siya himo og adjusting entry. Obviously, class kani nga accountant, di gani siya graduate og SJR, no? Kay kung graduate pa nag SJR, di gani makalimot. Okay, pero nakalimot man si accountant. Okay, so di ni siya graduate og SJR. Kay expense method ang imong client, ang imong business, wala nag-record si accountant og adjusting entry, therefore failure to recognize the asset. Okay, kay diba expense method atong adjusting entry adto recognize the asset man, no? So failure to recognize the asset, that means assets are wa nimo na recognize ang asset. So therefore assets are under. Assets are understated. Kung kay tanan na recognize man as expense, wa ka ga-record og asset, no? Tanan na agad sa expense. So that means your expenses are overstated. Okay, now remember, expenses and profit have an inverse effect. So mean to say, kung overstated ang expenses, understated na ang profit. And profit and equity have a direct relationship. Therefore, kung understated si profit, understated pud na si equity. Okay, so that is for prepaid expenses. Okay, now this one class might take a little bit of getting used to. No, so do not worry if medyo na confused pag gamay karon, no. So like I said, you could always hit pause on the video. You could go back to the discussion, and better yet, you could talk about this to your study buddies, no, para at least inyo habang ma-thresh out kung anong over man na siya, anong under man na siya. I would remember when I was in accounting 1, of course, a long time ago, no, when I was a student, nga naglibog gid ko pag-discuss sa mong teacher ani. So what I did was naghimuhimo ko mga hypothetical amounts. No? Now, what if the ay mo ni siya ang amount niya? Wa na ko ni na-record. So, kung sa may mahitabo niya. Okay? So, you could also do that if that works for you. Okay? Sige, basta ang hinumduman lang yun, class, kung asset method, ganina siya. Ito, ibalik class ha, sa atong previous na table ha. Kung asset method, ganina siya. The rule is you recognize the expense. Kung expense method, ganina siya. The rule is you recognize the asset. Meaning to say, kung asset method, unya, wala nag-adjusting entry si accountant, wa niya na-recognize si expense. So, nanubra ang asset, nagkuwang ang expense. Kung expense method gani na niya, wala na recognize ni ang accountant ang asset, no? Kaya niya kalimut siya imong adjusting entry, so nanubra sa expense, nagkuwang ang asset. Okay? Sige. Anyway, as we solve the problems, hopefully mas ma-appreciate mo. Okay? Now that was prepaid expense. Let us now talk about when a revenue is collected in advance before it is earned. So, gikuha ni mo daan ang kwarta, pero wala pa ni mo na-render ang service. This is an example of unearned revenue. Okay, so kanang unearned revenue class, two methods po ang pag-account ana. You have the liability method, mao po ni iyahang real approach, no? Ang liability method kay again, liabilities are balance sheet accounts and balance sheet accounts are real accounts. Okay? And the other method is called the income method. Income method is sometimes called the nominal approach because income or a revenue is an income statement account, which is a nominal account. Okay, so when you talk about the liability method, this means that the entire amount was recognized as a liability during the original entry. Meaning to say, pagdawat ani pag-record sa accountant niya na din siya nga, uy, wala para ba din ako na-render ang service ato pa utangan pa ko sa naghatag nako ani. No, kay magkinaon sa man gani ug di na ko man service, ako man dapat iuli ang kwarta. No, so mo na siya si liability method. Pero si income method or the revenue method says the entire amount was recognized as income during the original entry. So, pagdawat sa cash niya na ding accountant, ay anyway, ato naman gyapon ni i-render, no? Ato naman gyapon ni i-render ang service, no? Ato naman gyapon ni i-deliver. So, therefore, ato na lang siya i-recognize daan as income, no? So, mo na siya si income method. Same with the prepaid expenses, both methods are acceptable. Okay? But again, kung panalitan gani class, silent ang problem, tanawon sa nato ang account, no, ang gigamit sa business, pero wala gani dito, then the assumption is the liability method. Okay? Sige. Similar to what we did kanina, atong tanawon class, no, unsay effect niya. So under the liability method, everything is recorded as a liability. And because of that, walay gi-recognize na revenue on the original entry date. And so therefore, tungod kay tanan man gi-recognize as liability, kay man ta at the end of the accounting period, nga dili tanan pa ang na render niyang service, no? So therefore, ato ang didakan ang liability, and how do we decrease liability again? Would you remember? How to decrease liability? Liability is decreased by debiting the liability. Ug tungod kay a portion of that amount actually na-render naman niya, no? So, na-earned naman niya. So, dapat ta mo recognize sa revenue. And how do we recognize revenue? We recognize revenue by increasing revenue. And how is revenue increased? Debit or credit? Revenue is increased by crediting the revenue account. Okay? So, meaning to say, class, kung ari po ta sa income method then, under the income method, walay liability nga gi-recognize on the original entry, pero tanan iyang gi-recognize as revenue. So at the end of the accounting period, ato ang i-recognize ang liability portion. I-set up na to ang liability portion by crediting the liability. Di ba kay liability, credit normal balance man. So to increase it, you have to credit it. And in the same manner, we will then decrease the amount that was all charged to revenue. So ato nang kuhaan kaya nubra man na siya, no? Di man tanan na earned na. And so therefore we decrease revenue by debiting revenue. Okay? So kung liability method di ay, the rule is recognize the revenue. And when we say gani class recognize, that means we go to the normal balance of that. No? So how do you recognize revenue? Normal balance of revenue is credit. So in other words, recognize revenue by crediting revenue. Sa income method, we recognize the liability. Again, to recognize the liability, we increase the liability at the end of the accounting period by crediting the liability. Because liability has a credit normal balance. Okay? Sige. Now, ito to sa pang board exam nga level, no? What will happen if no adjusting entry is made? Unsa may effect niya sa liability, sa revenue, sa profit, and then later on sa equity. Okay? So, if no adjusting entry is made, remember, kung liability method na siya, that means the accountant failed to recognize the revenue. Okay? So, wa niya na-credit ang revenue. Pero kung income method na, that means the accountant failed to recognize the liability. No? So, wa niya na credit ang liability. Okay? Assuming no adjusting entry is made under the liability method, that means that the liability is sobra kuwang. Remember, under liability method, ang original entry ani kay liability tanan. No? So, wa siya naka-adjust ana. So, therefore, liability is overstated. And because the accountant failed to recognize the revenue, wa man niya gi-recognize ang revenue portion. So therefore, unsa na tabo sa tong revenue? Sobra kuwang. Remember, wa niya gi-recognize. So kay wa man niya gi-recognize, revenue is understated. Now, unsa ganito yung revenue class will also affect profit. If you remembered kanina, ang relationship ni expense ug ni profit is, unsa ganito? Inverse, no? Mo overstated gani expense, mo understated ang profit. Understated gani expense, overstated ang profit. Nga naman, dili man ang friends si expense ug si profit. Di ba? Kontra man silang duha. Pero karita ni revenue class, unsa kay relationship ni revenue ug ni profit? Do you think kontra sila or friends sila? No, revenue and profit. Di ba class? Friends man na sila. And so therefore, kay friends man na sila, no? Friends stick together man. So kung understated na si revenue, understated po na si profit. Unya, kung understated si profit, di ba si profit eventually ma-reflected under equity? Yung si profit ug si equity kay friends po na sila. No? So direct man na ilang relationship. So therefore, kung understated si profit, understated po na si equity. Okay? Kung income method na class ang gigamit sa business, unya wala nakahimog adjusting entry, okay, wa naghimog adjusting entry ang imuhang accountant na dili graduate sa USJR. No, so kay wa man gahimog adjusting entry, joke ra na class ha. Kay wa man naghimog adjusting entry, meaning to say tanan gi-recognize as income. Everything was recognized as income. And so because of that, wala na tagad si liability. Wala na recognize si liability. O kay wa man siya na-recognize, meaning understated si liability. Kuwang siya. Kaya wa man siya di-recognize. Unya kay tanan, to aman ni income, wa man kuhain, no, income man tanan. So overstated si revenue. And remember, revenue and profit are friends. So overstated na si revenue, overstated po na si profit. Yung friends po na ba na si profit o si equity? No? So direct relationship. Overstated ganin na si profit, overstated po na si equity. Okay? Now, those are some concepts, no, that I hope that the previous videos that you have viewed, no, were able to somehow impress upon you. So, karon class, atong isolve ang mga problems nga atuang gisolve sa inyong practice set. Okay? But para dili kayo taas atong video, ako sana siyang i-stop kadiyot, no? And then ato siya i-continue in the next video. So in the next video, we will already solve the problems. Okay? So ako na siya i-cut aron dili kay taas. But please do not forget to watch the next video to this. Ha? Okay. I'll see you in the next video.